Adrian Hall to please come up and take over the next panel. Our next panel is on total coverage, smart cities, and rural communities. You've heard many of the speakers talk about the big disparity between wealth in different segments in Africa, also the gaps between the rural and the urban areas. That's the subject of this panel. And joining Adrian will be Beza Mama, who is the Director for Payment Applications at EthSwitch. Beza, will you please come up on stage? Also joining him will be Abel Mola, Senior Investment Advisor from the British Embassy in Addis Ababa. Will you also please come up, Abel? And let me also invite Chidi. This is a last minute request. Chidi, will you please come up to this panel also? This is on smart cities and rural communities. Please come up and join the session. As you just heard in the previous session, he is the Group COO of WTS, and he comes all the way to us from Nigeria. So Adrian, Beza, Abel, and Chidi will take us through the next 45 minutes on what are some of the issues with total coverage in countries, what are the issues for technology service providers, for operators, and most importantly, regulators. How can they all make all this stuff work together to do the magic? So we're going to have a very good discussion here for the next 45 minutes. Once again, please keep those questions coming, and great to have our four friends and colleagues back here again. So, Adrian, over to you for the next 45 minutes. Thanks, Adrian. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Congratulations, by the way. Full room first thing on a second morning is quite an achievement. How are we this morning? Are we awake? Wave, please. Good morning. Nice to see you all. Thank you very much, and welcome to the panel on one of my favorite topics, which is rural and urban connectivity. And welcome to our panelists. So to Beza from EthSwitch, from Abel at British Embassy, and from Chidi. Chidi, welcome all the way over there. I'm going to ask my panelists to introduce themselves. I'd like you, as you introduce yourself, this is a subject that is one we've discussed many times. Your companies, your roles don't necessarily indicate a focus on rural and urban connectivity. So for the sake of the audience, I know that you do focus in this area and with different perspectives. So could you, in introducing yourself and your company, just say a few words about what your perspective is and what's the relevance of urban and rural connectivity to you in your particular role? And if we could start with you, Beza, to give that indication, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, it's really an honor to be here with you guys. So I am Beza from EthSwitch, Director of Payment Application, as already introduced. So my view with regard to the smart city, I think that's the question. So smart city, when we thought, is a city which is connected, which can actually simplify the livelihood of individuals within the city. And necessary, this is the urban. When we thought of the smart city, it dwells and focus on the urban livelihood, but needs to be connected to the rural areas at the same time. As I'm coming from the central switch connectivity, one of the end milestone is payments. So whatever services is supposed to be done, whatever activity is going to be happen in a smart and connected environment, payment is a last milestone, and the payment happens electronically, gives sense for the full smartness of the society, so that it is more transparent, more accountable, and actually trustable. So this is my general overview, and it should be connected to the rural areas, because the rural areas are the source of food. They feed individuals who live in the urban, and necessary the the source has to be traceable, and they are also part of the financial system, not necessary to be excluded, and financial inclusion as part of it that I'm actually aspire for.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Peter. Abel, from your perspective at the British Embassy, what's your function in relation to connectivity, and what do you see as the need? Is it the same need in rural and urban, and just a little bit of an indication of that, and then we'll dive deeper in a little bit further in. But to start, if you could just give that insight, that would be great.
Great. Thank you. So, Adrian, I'm Abel. So, just a little bit background about what I do at the British Embassy. So, I work in the commercial space where I work with British businesses to enter the Ethiopian market, either in the investment side or export side. When I say export, is mostly from the UK to Ethiopia. It could be products and services in various sectors. So when it comes down to the financial sector, one of the big projects, obviously, one of the flagship projects that we've supported within the entire project lifecycle is Safaricom. So we've worked with Safaricom all the way from about 4 or 3 years ago when the privatization of the telecom sector was issued by the Ethiopian government. And what we did in those spaces is one, Safaricom is the first private telecom operator within the country, and followed by mobile money application M-Pesa, which we have supported through the negotiation, the deal, the government connection, regulation side, and for that. So we have a development angle as well within the British Embassy, which has several financial inclusion projects and programs, especially in programs that most know within the safety net program. One sort of making that sort of monthly payments through mobile money and other similar solutions. Followed by digital agriculture, especially on we have several projects, UK funded projects on sort of like setting prices, providing and sort of collecting and recording data for farmers to easily access and use in their daily agricultural practices. So what we usually do in those spaces is we try to bring in UK private expertise and UK private investment. So obviously it's not a donor program most of the time, but at the same time we also try to look at that angle. So just the overall picture that we're currently working on is financial inclusion, and financial sector in general is something that we prioritize on a macro level, setting up the policies, the regulations, and supporting the government in several technical assistance programs. And then on the grassroots level, we engage with communities and rural communities across Ethiopia, basically setting up that entire value chain and supply chain of products and offerings. One, sort of boosting local content, supporting local businesses, either in some sort of incubation programs. Also, sort of like funding those projects in the development space to achieve those results. So that's what we mostly gel.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Abel. That's very insightful. Chidi, I know that from your perspective, you're in Nigeria, for one thing. So I don't think that means that there's any difference in the challenges between urban and rural in Nigeria than there is in Ethiopia. And I think there's very clear parallels there. I know also from previous conversations that we've had that you've played a key role in supporting the development of rural infrastructure as well. So could you give us a little perspective for those who don't know and aren't as familiar with your efforts as I am, what you as a company do in Nigeria and where you see the alignment of rural and urban connectivity and the need for both?
Okay, thank you, Adrian. My organization, we build broadband networks primarily, and in my previous life, I've also played a role in the Universal Service Fund, yeah, which had a focus on rural connectivity, in itself. So one approach that we've seen that has helped with connecting the unconnected, or or bridging the digital divide, is if you look at Africa's population, and it's same for most individual countries within the continent, it's almost a 50-50 spread between the rural and urban areas. In our case, is a 60-40. It's about 60, roughly 60% in the rural communities and 40 of them in urban areas. So what we've seen that has worked, very well is where operators build the infrastructures, of course, to target the transit cities. You find the cities within Africa which can make commercial sense, which of course the commercial viability to deploy infrastructure or build services, people who can afford it. They are kilometers apart, and so while the operators are building their transit infrastructure to service the clusters, what we've seen that has worked better is for them to actually drop services in those transit rural communities. And that's about the best approach we've seen, especially on the fiber broadband side. Okay. So once you are able to, let's just take, for instance, you're building a 10G DWDM circuit between two major cities that are 100 kilometers apart. There are rural communities that you will transit across that route, drop services within those communities. The business case for those rural communities will be strengthened by the fact that you already have off-takers within the transit communities and also at the edge cities that you are targeting. And that's one approach we've seen has worked a lot more. There was a study by Nigeria's USPF which showed that in terms of broadband, 70% of the communities are still unconnected, or the population in terms of broadband. But of course, in basic digital voice service, 100% is connected, but broadband service itself, you still have rural unconnected communities. One approach the Universal Service Fund takes is to target incentive-based build out to those communities, essentially saying, okay, so we direct your investment to these communities, but you get a tax break, for instance, if you service these rural communities, or we help with becoming an off-taker for some of the communities. There are a cluster of universities in our space as well that the USPF has decided to fund their recurrent services. So the operator builds the capex side of the infrastructure, USPF pays for the recurring services. The sustainability is a big question, but at least it gives that leg into connecting those unconnected communities. So what we still propose to every operator, even in our own space, is target the communities that are within your transit routes, provide services within those communities. And then even if they are not the commercial viability, even if they are not able to pay up the right service values, you can also create plans that target those rural communities. So that way you are able to capture the entire market space. And by the way, there are also universal service obligations for every operator. Unfortunately, enforcement hasn't been top notch, and it's understandable. You cannot. It's difficult to force the market to certain prices at certain times. But I think the regulators should also start looking at enforcing universal service obligations.
Chidi, that's very insightful, and there's a lot that you are involved in, and that is being done clearly in Nigeria, and you're an active participant in that. I think the impression I get from all of the panelists and from the conversation I had yesterday with Vim, for those who were here, he said 4G is a fundamental right, even for the most rural person. It shouldn't be a very basic connection just because they're in the middle of nowhere. They should still have 4G. They should still have data connectivity. Now, you mentioned the point about chasing the dragon. Do we need all of these technologies everywhere? Do we need to? Because the challenge of rural connectivity is the value proposition. However, if you look at advanced technologies and the use of data rather than the use of voice and SMS messaging, which, let's be honest, you're not going to generate a lot of revenue out of that. But with data services and more involved product lines, then maybe you can start to improve the ARPU and justify the investments. Do you believe that the challenge is one of, well, there's many. There's the cost, there's the policies and regulations, the enforcement of universal service. But is there also a challenge with the education of the people in those areas as to what technology can do for them? And is there a challenge with regards to devices and giving them access to devices so that they can actually take advantage of those opportunities? I think the answer is yes to all of those, but what would you say could be fixed? Because you've got to start somewhere. Where would you start if you had the chance to have an impact, Beza, on the investment into rural connectivity? And where would you start? Where would you say the biggest impact would come?
Yeah, primarily there has to be a need assessment. Following that, investment comes because especially when it comes to the rural communities, it's not the technology. Before the technology, they have adapted their own way of doing it. So the technology will assist. It's not the final milestone for them. So we have to look at to do a need assessment and customize because products come up with their own shield way of presentation, which cannot directly fit to the ruler needs. So it has to be customized. Say, for instance, for those live in a very remote rural areas without a deep education, if you provide an authentication mechanism using a PIN, it cannot work. Instead, a fingerprint might fit for their needs. So we need to understand, we need to look at it, the detailed requirements, the detail actually socio-economic and the social linkage of the societies so that the technology will assist and it can be served for their purpose. So need a system, assessment and customization. Then government should also assist on actually waiving for the tax for devices when it comes to the deployment, and there has to be also a joint venture with operators and others who are actually involved in that environment.
Okay, great. So a needs assessment, an understanding and a development of services that fulfill the needs and support the objectives. You're quite right. Technology is an enabler and it supports people to do what they already do, but better and more efficiently. And if it can also provide them with the opportunity to do something that they weren't able to do, of course, but there's an engagement process there that needs to happen. It's interesting to know who is responsible for that. Maybe, Abel, you could give some insight into your thoughts on who's responsible for driving that. And also the same question about what's, in your opinion, the most impactful activity that could drive rural connectivity?
Yeah. So definitely, EthSwitch and Beza have more experience. I think it's over 10 years now since within operations, so they definitely have that grassroots level engagement. But within our team's operation and how the UK government bilaterally works with the Ethiopian government, I think one of the steps that we were thinking to sort of work with the government is through infrastructure sharing and public-private partnership. So mainly, since now that the telecom sector has been liberalized and we have a private telecom operator and potentially a new one by next year. I'm thinking, why not? Why just stop there? We should also be looking into potentially telecom tower privatization. If I get the data right, I think there's a big gap of about 3,000 or 4,000 telecom towers in Ethiopia to kind of fulfill or increase the number of coverage and access, and that's about 1.6 or 1.7 billion dollar investment just in Ethiopia alone. And I remember the gentleman's conversation. So I think there needs to be that sort of conversation with the government, saying that, okay, what are the benefits and also what are the cons in sort of doing that? And the government can only do so much with public finance. Currently with Ethio Telecom, doing an expansion. They're doing a great work in expanding to other regional, other neighboring countries at the moment. I think some of them are in the pipeline. And I also agree on the incentive and subsidy part of this conversation. So there's a big gap of access, as I just mentioned, not just in the network, but in the energy. One of the very interesting maps that I've seen is the entire grid connectivity of Ethiopia, where if you just draw a line in the middle of the country, the western side of Ethiopia is more connected because of n- um, um, being near to several of the hydro projects and things like that, but the entire east side of Ethiopia is basically empty. So potentially other solutions in the off-grid space could sort of kind of create that energy access, which will lead to access to connectivity devices, which leads to connectivity and so forth. So I think there is that sort of conversations. And a couple of weeks back, even for an example, I was in some sort of conversations for alternative connectivity solutions. One of the conversations that came up is why don't we just bring low Earth orbit satellites that which Starlink, the organization, the company uses. But I think there's a big question of affordability there, and I don't think even Starlink is sort of ready for the Ethiopian market because Ethiopia's telecom sector is just being liberalized, and there needs to be a lot of precedent set for other operators to come into the market and operate. So I think the best option for now is sort of looking at for the government to sit down and look at, okay, what are the benefits of liberalizing telecom towers at the same time and bringing in private sector into it, and also at the same time localize digital solutions and how to strengthen that. So there's a lot of element that comes to it, either with donors, with private sectors. There's a lot more partnerships that could definitely come through that, which is obviously one step of many that needs to be taken, which I'm going to stop here now.
Great, thanks, Abel. So open access infrastructure could be a key driver of the reduction of the cost for the network operators so that infrastructure can go further and costs mitigated across a broader spectrum of delivery of service, etc. They are in Ethiopia, I think, showing an interest towards that. We see that with the open access data centers that are now in country. Towercos would definitely play a key role. I guess from a government perspective, they want to take this at a pace that they're comfortable with, but I agree. And fiber, towers, data centers, shared costs over these things and having companies that are focused on those. I know, for instance, that on the towers, a towerco can raise finance that a mobile operator can't because they're focused in a certain area. So I think, do you think there's an education requirement here in terms of communications, maybe an open forum, which we're all for, of course, where the government are more informed about what that means and how it works and what's the potential, and they can inform the market on how that can work here? Is that, do you think, something that could support that? Oh.
Yeah, maybe a quick response before I pass it on. Definitely, especially in the agriculture sector, which is I think 70% of the GDP. Some large percentage of employment comes from agriculture. There's a big opportunity here for the government or even other similar institutions with an interest to kind of mobilize their resources and initiate some sort of programs in those spaces. And I think the digital applications in general, especially in the agri space, I'm going to specify that around that, is quite useful for farmers to have that sort of access. It could be about soil, weather, about pricing of products. It could be about those that they buy, and also the products that they sell, from fertilizer to all of the raw commodities that they produce. That sort of access in general will indirectly sort of benefit and add to the entire value chain of increasing education amongst the vast rural areas of Ethiopia. So there is obviously they just need basic connectivity to achieve those things. They don't need to go further and involve, new technologies like the AI and cloud computing, but they just need a simple device. It doesn't have to be even a smartphone. There's better options that local solutions are currently operating across the country. It's just about sort of amplifying the current solutions into and then pushing them to sort of expand their operations. And that could be done either in an equity investment, which is now something that is becoming a trend in Ethiopia. It could also be by some sort of joint ventures where where companies, for example, in my space, UK companies can come in with the expertise and the knowledge and this sort of the technology and have some form of joint venture agreement with a local company and for the next 10 years or so, so that there is a knowledge transfer and a technology transfer in both angles that pours into the local company. That local company takes it forward. So I think sort of working around those in general would definitely benefit in the education space. When everyone's using daily their smartphone or any basic connectivity devices, I think that will increase the use and the usage of those sort of services. So I think it just falls on the entire policy and infrastructure side that we just have to put in, which indirectly goes to the long-term education impact that you just mentioned.
Thank you. Chidi, from a Nigerian perspective, and obviously because you are an infrastructure provider as well of fiber, which is clearly data focused, you're not text message focused or low bandwidth related focus. What do you do, or what has been done that's been successful in Nigeria that has educated those rural market? Now, I say rural, but also the urban markets into the usage and the advantages and the benefits of technology? Is it the end users that you focus on? Is it for instance, the government agencies for healthcare education? Is it the banks for finance? Where does the education start, and how has it been successful in educating the market into the need for adopting technology?
There's always the telecom triple A question, the issue around availability, affordability, and accessibility. While the affordability question is an end user driven, comes from the end user side. Of course, the issues around availability is driven from the supplier end. So I think the education on the enlightenment comes from both ends. Um, the challenge always is that the end user has a bigger question to answer. The issues around affordability is not just a price and income question, it's also about other spending choices he has, especially for the rural community side um, telecom service consumer. While for the provider, his issues around providing the service is capex based and opex, and of course driven by regulation and the rest of it. So I think what has worked and what I think can work more again is the government should continue to look at having sector specific or providers. There have been efforts in the past to have rural telephony operators licensed specifically for the rural communities. That has had its challenges because many of them did not have access to the right spectrum. They didn't have access to the right capex because, of course, economics does not add up. So what I think will still continue to work is the collaboration between the big operators and maybe the smaller small cell telcos who can focus, who can have a more rural or underserved community focus. They just focus on those areas. They get some incentives, which could be grant based, which could be uh, uh, some capex from the government or whatever that could be. They focus on those rural or niche areas and then collaborate with the big operators so that they can meet the obligations of rural connectivity or the universal service obligations that are required. So in terms of education or enlightening the end user, I'll put it this way: the market is hungry. In fact, if you bring in telecom services, no matter how rural the community is, you'll find out that if you ask any rural operator, everywhere they've gone in to deploy service, they've always had 100% uptake because the market, they require these services. And what you also see that happens, most times they actually want to leapfrog. Of course, the challenges are on device affordability and the rest of them. Once they can overcome that access issue, you find out that you get a lot of usage in those communities. And I'll give you a scenario. In my previous life, long time ago, maybe some 15 years ago, I worked for a provider that had um, some rural community focus. It was a broadband provider as well. But he had some. He provided services at the edge of a city and a rural community. And we installed a base station. This was during the days of 3.5G FWA. We installed a base station in a community, and the bulk of the uptake we got was from the rural side of the community and not even the urban side. So you find that much hunger and appetite for services. What is just required is availability of the service. Um, we've tried to explore certain approaches even in Nigeria. At least in the last couple of months, there has been discussions with the regulator, with the ministry, and with the Universal Service Fund around when for instance, when you moonlight some of the 3G or 2G technologies, move them to the rural communities. This could be something you will have to ask, you could have to mandate the telcos to do so that uh, these evolutions of the technology goes to the rural communities as they upgrade the services in the urban areas to 5G or 6G or whatever technologies happen. And the advantage of that again is that of course, the data centers can remain in the urban areas because there may not be that much incentive to take edge data centers to rural communities for now. But because there is connectivity, high speed connectivity, or any type of connectivity leveraging those assets, they can also have access to those services that are provided on these data centers. Essentially, the data centers and the cloud democratizes access to everybody, whether you're in the rural or in the urban communities. And that's one approach we think will work. But in terms of education, I'll put it this way: I think the market is already sensitive and waiting. Every time you get a service to whether it's a rural community and it is usable, the driver is the use case. Once they can find a use case for those services, the consumption is almost 100%.
Thanks, Chidi. Very insightful. Madam, I was going to suggest, can we see if there's any questions from the audience before I...
Questions from the audience before we move on to our next workshop? We can take a couple of quick questions. Yes, can we get a mic over there? Thanks. I can see it's a friend from Safaricom. Good. Any other questions? We can get the mic to you afterwards. Yeah. Wow, two questions.
Okay, Bethlehem from Safaricom Ethiopia. I just want to highlight on what was discussed yesterday. The infrastructure gap that exists in this country is a good testimony that in order to bridge the gap, we require a concerted effort from different actors, not just the operators. As was discussed by the panel, the operators are primarily responsible to ensure that there is coverage across the country, and it's part of their obligations. But you can see that after several years of having operators in this country, we still have a gap that we require to, to bridge. And with that context, I would like to ask you, what role would you expect independent, infrastructure service providers, independent infracos would play in Ethiopian market? Do you think it is essential for us to also onboard such type of independent infracos? And what role would you expect them to play in terms of bridging the existing infrastructure gap and collaborating with operators? What are the best experiences from the markets that you have seen? Is the first question that I have. Second one is with regards to the universal access framework that was discussed by the panelists from Ghana. Universal service is something that the Ethiopian government is also trying to introduce. The Ethiopian Communications Authority is trying to collect levy from both operators, and that also doing infrastructure gap assessment, and that levy would, in form of a subsidy, would be given to a winning operator. There would be a bid, and then the operator would, reach out to these uncovered and remote areas of the country. I think it's a very good initiative that AFRICOM Ethiopia is also supporting. But what's the best experience in terms of administering the levy? Now, the way that it's set up in Ethiopia is the UAS framework is within the Ethiopian Communications Authority. And the authority has several mandates, very vast mandates. Is it good to place it within this authority, or is it good to have an independent agency that will administer this levy to ensure that it's effectively utilized towards the purpose that's being collected? Thank you.
Okay, just hold the answer. Let's take one more. There was a hand up here. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to ask about the investment you have been talking about. So whenever we are talking about investment, there should be a peace, there should be stability. Unless there is a stability, unless there is peace, investment may not be possible. Again, whenever we talk about infrastructure, it also depends on peace, on stability, on investment also. From your own experience, how are the investors, especially who are dealing in Ethiopia, their responsibility? Second, so yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Last question. Yeah, go on.
Thank you. My name is Ammar, and I'm an architect. So you can guess my experience is more about beam and column connection rather than digital connection. So this said, I believe that smart cities are built together with other sectors, such as construction and medicine and also etc. So my question is, how would you say other sectors could contribute to the building of smart cities in Africa? Thank you.
Okay, that is three very good, tough questions also. Quick responses, please. Thanks.
If I can give a short answer to the infrastructure question, the InfraCo question. As I mentioned earlier, some of the advantages that an InfraCo would have over an operator is access to a different kind of finance. So they're able to get finance at a cheaper cost than an operator because they have the fixed assets and they can offset the cost of the loans with those assets. They can also mitigate costs by sharing the infrastructure across multiple operators. So therefore, you reduce the costs in that way as well. So there are a number of ways where the InfraCos can support. Also, telecom operators stand risk of becoming dumb pipes when they own the infrastructure and they are the service provider. Dumb pipe meaning all they're doing is providing the access to clients for companies that want to sell services. The money is in the services. And as operators can release capital through engaging with InfraCos, whether it's fiber, whether it's towers, or whatever it might be, they can reinvest that into services which they can then deliver over their own network. So you're not then providing Silicon Valley with access to valuable clients in country. You can actually develop and deliver those services yourself as an operator with a familiarity of the local market and benefit from that. But I'd welcome anybody else's insight into that as well. Chidi, please.
Yeah. So I'll start with the universal access fund question. Is it good to domicile it within the regulator? Now, just know that one of the big challenges in most African countries is the dominance of the government through the regulator. So, and you do understand that in most countries, the lifespan of most governments is 4 years. So sometimes they think in 4 year cycles. Not just that they think in 4 year cycles, those in parliament or those regulators are also political appointees most times. So what we're seeing in my environment, and that's an experience we've had most times, is when it comes to providing access to rural communities or underserved communities, it becomes a competition of which of the rural communities do we go to first. So the funds are available is about 2.5% per operator on their gross revenues per annum. And these are huge revenues, at least in our environment, huge revenues. So it becomes political funds that are fought over. So the parliament is allowed to oversee the spending of those funds. So they begin to fight on which community do we need to go to first. And before you know it, 4 years is gone. The next government comes in, and that fight ensues in the rural communities. So oftentimes, I think it has to be a balance between, in our environment, it was fully with the regulator, but recently it got moved to somewhere in the middle of the ministry and the regulator. So I think having it somewhere independent could be of help so that they can actually fund the gaps that need to be implemented. And then the question around the quick question around having infracos or having infrastructure companies. I think Adrian is spot on the answer as well. You having those specialized areas. In my environment, for instance, the towercos have done fantastic job. Close to over 40,000 towers across the nation today and counting as well. And many of them are also within rural communities, so they become anchor places to provide services in those clusters. And then for the fiber infrastructure, we also try to license regional infracos who are cluster specific. They are supposed to build out infrastructure in the clusters, and then the telcos and other service off-takers can now off-take service from them. So you have that focus, and then operators can focus on reselling service and being at the top of the layer.
Thanks, Chidi. Yes, please, Abel, just briefly,
Yeah.
if you could respond
So
to
if
one
I
of the
could
questions.
maybe respond to the two other questions. Yeah.
Please.
So recent stability is obviously one of the anchors for open investment, and it's not news for everyone just to go through the past few years. But it's quite challenging, even in some of the projects that we support in the mining sector. We have projects in all the way to West Walega, where there was some issues. But in energy projects, we have some in the Southwest region and things like that. So it is definitely one of those conversations you need to have with the government. So we always consider Ethiopia as a high risk but high reward type of market. So it's also not an established market, and it's sort of like a horizon market. So you either be a first mover into the country, and in 10 years or so you've established your business. Now that your revenues, your dividends are coming in. So that sort of thing is how we're operating. So the way we always engage with a company when they decide to come in any sector is we give them the entire context. So this is the challenges, this is the opportunities. It's up to you to decide. And these companies are quite smart. They do their own sort of due diligence. They do their own some sort of assessments to make that decision to come into a market like Ethiopia. And Ethiopia's market is a very underserved market, and the opportunities, even in the agri space, the local demand is big. In the energy space, now Ethiopia is exporting power. There's a big infrastructure gap in transmission and distribution that creates more appetite for investments to come in. In the mining sectors, which I would come into the other question, is the mining sector could also be one of the injecting type of sector to the telecom, especially in the manufacturing. So I think when you look at the entire deposits, there's a big silica or silica sand deposit in Ethiopia, in the Afar and Somali region, but I have not seen any projects being proposed within the Ministry of Mines or any other companies all over the world. So that creates a huge opportunity. And so you need silica sand to produce the fiber optic glass, which with a bit of value addition, which creates more opportunities for even Ethiopia to produce its own fiber optics. So that maybe potentially around e-commerce, I think is the next big thing that's coming. I actually was involved in one project with the Ethiopian Communication Authority.
Abel, if we
Can we move
just
on?
leave to
Yes, just one more point. So there's a .et domain and in Ethiopia, which is currently being managed by Ethio Telecom. When you compare that to .uk domains in the UK, currently the Ethiopia have about 3,500 .et websites on e-commerce, but when you look at the UK, there's over 14 million. So you can clearly see the huge gap there, where other investments, even local and international companies, could come in. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Abel. Beza, last words to you.
Yeah, maybe to respond to the third question. Yeah, the title under is about the smart city, but within a smart city, we can have different smart fragments like the smart building, the smart traffic management and transportation, the smart houses, and as well as we can have also the smart houses. Now we are dwelling only on the infrastructure because the smart city is a set of connected things. It is highly based on the IoT invention. So once we have things which are interconnected, the smartness is a service. And that is my actually response for the last question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beza. Abel, Chidi, thank you very much. Very informative, very insightful. We could go on longer, but we can't go on longer because we're told to get off. But thank you very much. Thank you.
Adrian, Beza, Abel, and Chidi, thanks so much for a fantastic panel. Big round of applause, please, for an outstanding session. May I invite you all to come here for a group photograph, please? Clearly, they provoked a lot of very good reaction from the audience. Thanks again for all those questions. Please keep the questions